Shelves that are out in the corridor, the faculty corridor upstairs in the art building, where we return papers and exams. And so you can go up and get your exam. Also, I've put on reserve in the art library a grading outline that I made up to help explain the grading system I used in case you had any questions about that. Also, sometime later this quarter, I will try to find a time to go over the midterm exam, both for those of you who took it and also just as good preparation for the final. Basically, the final will have a somewhat similar format to the midterm exam, except that there will also be at least one essay question. And when we have our prep session for the final, I will explain how the essay works. I'll probably hand out some study questions ahead of time that will help you prepare for the essay. Okay. Today, I'd like to look at the invention of the skyscraper at the end of the 19th century. Wait a minute. I had one here. There we are. At the end of the 19th century, the invention of the skyscraper, which established basically the principles that are still used in skyscraper construction. They've gotten much taller, of course, and they come in varying shapes, and there have been a lot of technological refinements, but the basic system that skyscrapers use today is pretty much the same as at the beginning. When the Reliance building, for example, that we see on the left there, was built in Chicago around 1890, and we'll be looking at it later. Just as an example of a more recent skyscraper, I show the Sears Tower in Chicago, which I think is still was the tallest building in the world when it was built in the 1970s. Maybe it's not now. It's hard to keep up, and it depends partly on how one defines the height of these buildings. But it's certainly, if not the tallest, one of the tallest buildings in the world. But essentially using pretty much the same structural system that we'll be looking at today. Also, which is one of the reasons that I decided to really focus on the beginnings of the skyscraper, and we won't be talking a lot about skyscrapers later in the course. But occasionally, there may be some reason to look at a skyscraper. But I think the most interesting story about the skyscraper is how it was invented in the early stages, and so that's what I've chosen to focus on in this course. Also, the skyscraper is clearly one of the most distinctive American contributions to world architecture. In fact, in the early 20th century, European architects considered the skyscraper, or at least most of them did, who were interested in American architecture, considered the skyscraper to be the important American building type. And it influenced and inspired some of these Europeans in various ways. Just as one example of this, in the 1920s, architects like Mies van der Rohe in Germany and others, Le Corbusier in France and others, did their own visionary designs for skyscrapers. And here we see one designed by Mies van der Rohe. We're looking at a model of it here that he built. And these designs help to clarify the principles of the international style, as it was called, that was emerging at this time in Europe in the 1920s. But the interesting thing to keep in mind is that the skyscraper was still considered an exclusively American form, and none of these European designs was built in Europe until much later. There was no such thing as really a skyscraper in Europe, basically until after the Second World War. Well, how and why did the American skyscraper evolve? We've seen some hints of the early stages, or precursors, we might say, of the skyscraper. For example, we've seen that cast iron system that was devised by James Bogardus and others in New York City around 1850. It was used for commercial and factory buildings. And here we see one of these that we saw in class, the Wainwright Building in New York in the late 1850s, which also, as you may recall, I think I mentioned when we looked at this cast iron building, that it also had one of the first elevators, the first practical elevators invented by Mr. Otis. And that, of course, is one of these technical requirements that was needed before skyscrapers could develop. And these cast iron buildings of this sort were constructed all over the United States in the next couple of decades. That is in the 60s and 70s, 1880s. And they're good examples in San Francisco. And in fact, in most large American cities, one can find good examples of these cast iron buildings from the mid to late 19th century. And here's a lot of some of them in San Francisco, in the Jackson Square area, which was not destroyed by a downtown part of San Francisco that was not destroyed in the 1906 earthquake and fire. But in these cast iron buildings, which, as you can see, were not necessarily very tall, sometimes just 2 or 3 stories tall. Here are 2 of them you see here. And it's sometimes hard to tell, really, that they're made of cast iron, because the height is clearly could have been built out of stone or brick or some traditional material. And sometimes the only giveaway, unless you go up and actually kind of knock on them and you see that they're made almost completely out of iron, is the only giveaway is the proportions often of the ground floor. That they're large open areas of large windows, and that the structure is relatively light, probably lighter and thinner than it could have been if it were brick or stone or a traditional material. But this system, this cast iron system, did not lead directly to the skyscraper as we know it. There were some problems with cast iron. For example, it wasn't strong enough to support more than 5 or 6 floors at the height of the Wainwright Building over there. But also, it was found to be more susceptible to fire than people thought at first. It didn't really burn, of course, the actual iron, but in a fire, it often lost some of its structural strength, and the building would sometimes collapse. So it turned out to have more problems than people thought at first. Bogardus, as you may remember, had thought it was the answer to all architectural problems. He wanted all buildings to be made out of cast iron, and there was a kind of feeling that it was the perfect material, but it turned out to be having some problems. Nevertheless, there was an increasing demand for taller buildings in American cities as the rapidly growing commercial centers in America developed, especially in New York and Chicago. And it resulted in buildings such as the one on the one on the right here, a kind of transition building to the skyscraper. This building is called the Tribune Building in New York City. I was about to say was, I didn't know whether to say was or is. The building still exists, but it's been changed a lot, and some floors were added later, and so it doesn't really look like this now, which is why I used this old engraved image of it. It was built in the 1870s, and the architect was a person we've seen already, Richard Morris Hunt, the man we looked at last week or a couple of lectures ago. The architect to the super wealthy, like the Vanderbilts, who's mainly known for his lavish houses, those palatial houses in Newport and elsewhere, and who was the first American apparently to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. But he also did some urban commercial buildings like this, including this Tribune building. It suggests that architects are, the major architects do work in many different fields by this time. The height of the Tribune building was 10 stories, or about 10, depending on exactly how you count them here, but not counting that tower that you see up at the top. So it was a very tall building for this time. In fact, it was probably the tallest commercial structure, or structure with floors in it, built up to that time. But the structural system was a bit of a little complicated. It was a mixture of some iron in the interior. There's some iron columns but also traditional masonry on the outer walls. And this had limitations. For example, the walls had to be very thick, especially at the bottom, to support the structure, and this wasted a lot of floor space. Since the whole point of building taller buildings was to get as much floor space for these commercial buildings in crowded cities, so that was a problem. And it wasn't until the 1880s that a new system made possible a kind of quantum leap, we might say, in building heights, producing really tall structures. And actually, that was what I wanted on that side. Don't go back here. Really tall structures, and in the process, of course, creating a completely new kind of urban environment like nothing the world had really ever seen before. And on the left, here we see Chicago, one of the Chicago downtown streets in around 1890, when this development principally occurred, and where it occurred first in Chicago. It was also in Chicago that the term skyscraper was coined, apparently, to describe these unprecedentedly tall structures. Well, so why did this happen mainly in Chicago? There are apparently several reasons, so this is often debated and talked about. But Chicago in the 1880s was experiencing a lot of commercial and industrial expansion as the economic center of the Midwest. Land values were very high and continuing to rise, and this prompted people to build higher and higher buildings. Also, a possible factor was simply that Chicago seems to have been more receptive to new ideas than the more establishment East Coast cities like New York. Well, there are several interesting aspects of the skyscraper story and the invention of the skyscraper, but I think mainly there are two parts of it, we could say. One is the technological aspect. How was this actually done? And we'll talk about that. But then there's the aesthetic aspect, or the visual aspect, which in some ways is just as interesting or more interesting than the technological of this. First, let's look at the technology. The major innovation here was something called steel frame construction. And this is illustrated in the slide. I'll get back to this in a minute, explain what this is. You sometimes read different terms for this system. It's usually called the steel frame, sometimes steel cage, or skeleton construction, but I use the term steel frame mainly. Well, steel, so first of all, it uses steel, and then we've been looking before at cast iron. Steel is basically iron, but which has been treated in special ways, without getting into the technical details about this, to give it extra strength and extra structural properties. And so basically steel is just a stronger form of iron. Iron is the basic element. And steel has alloys and other things that are done to it. And steel became available on a large scale in the mid and especially late 19th century due to the Bessemer process and other processes like this, and it began to be used on a large scale in buildings as just a better form of iron, stronger. And one of the things that it allowed was this steel frame system. And here we see a view of one of these Chicago skyscrapers under construction around 1890. This happens to be the Fair Building is the name of the building. And it shows because it's not one of the most important skyscrapers from a point of view of innovations, but the nice thing about it is that it just happens that while it was under construction, someone did this very nice engraved view of the construction process, which shows beautifully what the underlying structure is. Actually, the building is over here as well. This is all the same building. It's just that this part has been built higher, and they're putting the facade on. And I'll get back to that question of the facade in a minute. But so we're actually seeing the same building in these two parts of the slide in this nice engraved view. And this system, this steel frame system, was worked out primarily by a man named William LeBaron Jenney. And he's the one. There are other, it wasn't one person's invention. There were a whole group of people working on these things at the same time. But he's often the person who's credited with having the largest role in its development. Well, Jenney was, not strictly speaking, an architect. He was an engineer who had been trained in Paris at the National Technical School there. It was called the École Centrale, which was probably the best engineering school in the world at that time. So it's interesting that it's an American. Americans, by this time, were going to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, as we saw, to study architecture. But some engineers went there as well to study engineering. Then Jenney had returned to the United States, and around 1880, in Chicago, had worked out this system of steel construction. Basically, it's just a framework of steel columns and beams that are bolted or riveted together. And Jenney worked out the details about how the floors are supported with subsidiary beams of a slightly smaller dimension, and what the proportions of these were and how they'd be joined together. And so he worked out the basic system of how it all goes together. That's still basically, as I mentioned before, the more or less the method of skyscraper construction that's still used today. But then, and this is what's interesting, on the exterior of this steel frame, the outer wall was attached, and this is the part that you see over here, where the building is actually is in a more completed stage over there, and you can see the facade looks completely different from this. So an outer wall was attached, really just hung onto the frame with no load-bearing function. In other words, the actual wall that we're seeing there does not really even support itself. It's simply attached to the steel frame. And this came to be called a curtain wall, or cladding. Again, various terms that are used for it, but probably the most common term that you hear is a curtain wall, because it's just hung. It's not actually supporting the building. And this cladding or curtain wall could be made out of various things. It could be brick, or thin pieces of stone, or ceramic panels of various sorts, or even metal sheets of some sort. There were various types of cladding that could be used. Well, what was the reason for this? Why did you really need a cladding? There were several reasons. One was to protect the steel from rust and from heat. If there was a fire, again, one wanted to keep heat away from even the steel frame. But also, and probably even more important, at least at the beginning, was just to create a wall, since there were these such a large area here is created by the steel frame. Notice how wide the spacing is between the columns. The width of the bay is certainly wider than in traditional architecture, and I'll get back to that in a minute as well. But there's this big open space, and it couldn't all be filled in with glass, partly because it was prohibitively expensive, or not even possible maybe at that time to have sheets of glass that large, and they didn't want to have a whole wall of glass. And so they wanted to create a more traditional type of wall that would have smaller windows in it. And all of these points I'll get back to in a moment. The advantages of the steel frame were, there were a number of them. First, of course, is that the strength of this steel frame allowed these buildings to be built much taller than previously. But there were other advantages as well. For example, the fact that there were only a few of these steel beams, and they could be widely spaced, and they themselves could hold up the wall and the cladding. Didn't need any other solid walls as in traditional buildings. It meant that the interior spaces of these buildings could be free of the load-bearing walls that traditional buildings needed. And previously to this, if you had a large building of this sort, there would have to be solid walls, not only on the exterior of the building, but inside as well, going in various directions. And that, of course, would have determined how the building inside was going to be broken up, where the offices would be, and so forth. But this now meant that the interior space could be divided any way the client wanted, the people who were building the building or renting the floors. And this produced the notion of open planning and flexibility, and it's an important aspect of modern architecture, especially for the design of office buildings and other kinds of public buildings like this. And this advantage was recognized by the architects and engineers of these buildings right from the beginning, and there are advertisements where they talked about how the elimination of the load-bearing wall meant that there could be complete flexibility as far as the dividing up of the office space inside these buildings. That was a selling point for it. Well, William LeBaron Jenney designed a number of these buildings, and then other architects and engineers, of course, started doing so as well. Jenney himself had experimented with parts of this system as early as 1879 or so, but the first true steel frame structure of his was probably one that's called the Home Insurance Building, and here we see it. It was built in 1884 and had, I think, about 11 or maybe 12 stories. And so by this time, by the time that the Home Insurance Building was built in about the mid-80s, the technological problems of the skyscraper were largely solved, and people could just start building these. And you'd think, well, that's it. That was the end of the story. But in fact, there was another whole issue that began to concern the architects and engineers who were designing these buildings, which was a more aesthetic or visual question than a structural one. And basically, the question was how to handle the cladding, or these curtain walls, of these in these buildings. The problem was, that is, how to actually design it. What should it look like? The problem was that the shape of these skyscrapers was so totally different from that of any earlier types of buildings, because of its vast size of this buildings, not only the great height, but the length of these buildings, and especially the endless rows of floors and windows. The proportions and the scale of these buildings was all wrong in terms of traditional principles of architectural composition. One approach just didn't fit into any categories of how buildings were supposed to be designed in terms of its scale. One approach that's illustrated here by both of these buildings that we're looking at, the Fair Building and the Home Insurance Building on the left, was to divide the building into horizontal units of 2 or 3 or 4 floors, and you can see those here. And then to treat each one of these units as a traditional building, because each one of these had a more traditional proportion. So, and it's a little hard to see the details maybe, but if you look at this section here, for example, this 3-story section, it's really designed by Jenney as if it were a traditional building, in which he even uses traditional elements, classical elements like the pilasters here. There are even capitals up at the top of the pilasters. And so and then you can give a 3-story section like this the traditional proportions of columns or pilasters in this case, whereas if you had a pilaster that went all the way from the bottom to the top, obviously it would be completely improper proportions from a classical point of view or from a traditional architectural point of view. So by dividing it up into these horizontal units, one could stay within the traditionally appropriate architectural principles and proportions. So in a sense, it's pretending that the building is made up of traditional buildings just piled on top of one another. And this became, and the same thing is true, that's a little harder to see over in the left here, where here again is a pilaster with a capital up on top, and then there's another section down here, I guess, a little harder to see. Well, this became a standard device for designing skyscrapers in these early years, and I think Jenney himself always used that in his buildings. But other designers and architects in Chicago who started thinking about this question decided that this was unsatisfactory, really, and even something of a deception, to this pretense that it's really several traditional buildings just stacked up. And they felt that a totally new aesthetic should be created, appropriate to the skyscraper, rather than treating it in traditional terms. And ironically, these architects thinking about this problem were encouraged in this endeavor by a building that was not, strictly speaking, a skyscraper at all. This is one of these interesting little ironies one comes across in architectural history. And it's a building that had been built in Chicago in 1885. Actually, it was a new building. It had just been built at about the same time, or just a little before these other buildings we're looking at. And this is a building called the Marshall Field Warehouse, which was designed by our friend H.H. Richardson, right before his death. And it was later torn down. It doesn't exist anymore, the Marshall Field Warehouse. And so we only know it in these rather poor photographs, or at least I've never found any really good photographs. And it's not a skyscraper, first of all, because it's not all that tall, but more than that, because it does not use did not use the steel frame construction. It's a traditional building made out of masonry with heavy bearing walls. So technologically, it's of no interest at all. But it was of interest to these architects dealing with this more visual or aesthetic question, because first of all, it was a very large building. As you can see, it's a large building, not so much in its height, but in its overall mass, the expanse of its facades. It takes up a whole large city block. And the young Chicago architects were impressed with the way Richardson had treated this great expanse, and how he had done it in a very bold manner, with no apologies, no attempt to disguise the great expanse of the walls, or to pretend or break it up into smaller buildings. And there's no traditional architectural ornament here, as you can see. It's an example of that other extreme of Richardson's work from his Romanesque revival, where he stripped things down to the very basic architectural components. And also the architects were impressed by how Richardson simply used the proportions of the windows and the masonry piers, the basic elements of the building, to create variety and interest. For example, the way the windows start out this shape with this rhythm of arches that are created, and then as it gets higher, it's broken down and they're divided in half, and then less up at the top. And so it's simply using the proportions of the basic elements to create the design of this building without any attempt to disguise the mass and the extent of these walls. It's one of Richardson's most Spartan designs, and one of his boldest designs, quite at variance with the picturesque and romantic tendencies of the period. And I think this is what appealed to these young Chicago architects. It's a very rational building in that sense. But it was technologically not advanced at all. It's only in this formal sense, we might say, the design of the actual form of the building, which was more advanced than the technology. And you often get these kinds of contradictions, or not necessarily contradictions, but interesting differences between what's happening technologically and what's happening in terms of the form or the aesthetics. Well, one of the in another building which illustrates this to some extent, a somewhat similar situation, is one of the earliest attempts to find a comparably bold form for the skyscraper. This is another one of these buildings that's a strange kind of transition building, and also doesn't turn out to be quite what it looks like at first. This is one of the most interesting of these early Chicago skyscrapers. It's called the Monadnock Building. It was built beginning in 1889. And the architects, it was a firm called Burnham and Root. John Root was the older member of this firm. He was the principal designer of this building, but his young partner was Daniel Burnham, who was to become a major architect on his own after Root died in 1891. And we've run into Burnham before as a city planner, who worked on the Chicago World's Fair, as you remember, and did those city plans for Chicago and San Francisco right before the San Francisco earthquake. So Burnham's an interesting figure who is important both as an urbanist and as a designer of these skyscrapers. But what's interesting and kind of contradictory about the Monadnock Building is that, like the Marshall Field Warehouse Building, it is not really a steel frame structure. I think Burnham and Root probably would have wanted to try out this new steel frame system in designing it, but in this case, the client who built this Monadnock Building, an office building, insisted on traditional brick walls. And this points out, of course, that this was still something new and people distrusted it at first, or for one reason or another did not always want their engineers and architects to use this new system. And in this case, the client refused to go along and insisted on traditional brick walls, and it was really the last major building of this kind, and took masonry construction to its absolute limits. It was really surprising, actually, that they were able to build a building this tall using traditional masonry construction. But as a result, it necessitated some things that really didn't make much sense or were impractical. For example, in order to build a building this tall out of traditional masonry, it means that the walls, especially toward the bottom of the building, have to be very, very thick. And they're so thick here that it took a lot of the interior space from the building, and so it was sort of counterproductive in that sense. You can maybe get a bit of a sense of how these thick walls from looking at the window frames here, where the windows go way in, and especially down here. I don't know the actual dimension of the walls, but they're very, very thick. And so that was a problem, of course, and this was really the last tall building like this that was treated this way. So here, too, we have a building that is conservative from a structural point of view. It's really backward-looking technologically, but progressive from a formal point of view because of the way the building is handled. In this sense, it's the opposite of Jenny's skyscrapers, which were technologically advanced, but used that older system of just piling buildings one on top of another. But here you can see that this is a much more imaginative approach visually to what a skyscraper can look like. There are no major horizontal divisions. It's not divided into those horizontal parts. As in Jenny's buildings, the vertical dimension is emphasized completely, especially by these bay windows that extend out and rise the whole height or most of the height of the building. And there are various other unconventional aspects of the design. For example, the walls flare out just slightly at the bottom and also at the top. Maybe you can see that just a little bit up there. And as a result, it has gives it a very sculptural appearance. There's sort of a soaring feeling about it. It's a very beautiful building. And there are other little subtle details. Here, a detail of the corner of the building, where you can see that it starts out, the two facades come together at a normal corner at the bottom, but then as it goes up, it's cut off like this. Chamfered is actually the technical name, I think, for that, where it's cut off as it goes up at the top to create another plane along the edge there. But you can see in these photographs how the windows are relatively small, and you can get a sense of how big the walls have to be, especially at the corner, to support the traditional structure of the building. So it's still these bearing walls, traditional bearing walls. But from a formal point of view, it's one of the most innovative designs in American architecture. It had a lot of influence on the steel frame skyscraper. Then, and in fact, then in around 1890, in just the next year or so, all these things are happening very fast over just from one year to the next. Around 1890, Burnham and Root designed a true steel frame skyscraper. They finally got a client who was willing to go along and do it, and this is the Reliance Building, one of the most important of these early skyscrapers. And it was actually during the design of or the working out of the design of the Reliance Building that that Root died, and then Burnham took over the firm and completed the building himself, and that was the beginning of Burnham's independent career as an architect. And you can see clearly how different the building is as a result of the different structural systems. It just is clear that this has to be a steel frame building because of these large areas of glass. There's very little wall left, and it's such a contrast to like this corner when you look at those. This just says traditional bearing wall construction, and this says steel frame construction. Even if you didn't know, you could just tell from looking at it, or at least it would be quite clear from looking at it what the underlying structure is. But there's still this attempt to emphasize the vertical and to treat it as a tall building by, for example, the bay windows that are here, as in the Monadnock Building. It's just that they can have much more glass in them. So it increases the sense of verticality, but also, I guess, another reason for the bay windows is just to allow more light into the buildings, because you can have a window on the side as well of the bay. So that creates even more glass and light that can come in. And all the floors are the same, except for the ground floor, which has to be a little different because of the entrance into shops and things. But from there on up, it's exactly the same until we come to the roof, when there's a thin projecting roof that stops the vertical movement. That roof was later removed for some reason that I never have found out, and this is the way it looks now, or at least the last time I saw it in Chicago. But you can see from these views, maybe especially on the left there, a sense that it's practically all glass. The wall is almost all glass. The first really powerful statement of the glass skyscraper. Let me show one other detail. It shows a little here closer these walls, the cladding of these walls. In this case, the cladding is made of terracotta panels, a kind of ceramic panel which has a protective glaze on it, and that became one of the most popular materials to create the cladding. It was relatively light, a little lighter than probably brick or thin slabs of stone would have been, and so this terracotta, these panels became a popular form for, also they could be cast in any shape, and so you start getting eclectic character in the designs of these panels, cast with even with Gothic kinds of, or semi-Gothic ornament, as here in the Reliance Building, which here is probably the weakest part of the design. But it doesn't detract from the overall powerful impression of the verticality and the openness of the skyscraper system. Well, so this was one approach toward finding a new aesthetic for the skyscraper, but there are others as well, and let me show a couple of others. There were a lot of things happening at this time. It wasn't as though people immediately recognized that that Burnham's approach here was the right one, and they all of these different approaches had some things going for them. Here's a building called the Marquette Building, 1893, just 2 or 3 years after the Reliance Building, designed by another firm called Halliburton Roach. There was so much building going on in Chicago at this time. A lot of architectural firms were established, and Halliburton Roach were another one of the pioneers. And the major difference here, if you compare these two buildings, is that there's no strong, in the Marquette Building, there's no strong emphasis on the vertical dimension. You don't have these bay windows that give this a vertical thrust are missing from the Marquette Building, and in fact, there's almost no distinction between vertical and horizontal here. The horizontal surfaces that cover the beams are almost exactly the same as the columns. Maybe the columns come out a bit in front, but basically you have the feeling that that they're all the same. And if you think in your mind, or actually I guess I have a slide here, of that the steel frame system that one sees underneath in this engraving of the Fair building, to remind you what's happening structurally, you can see that in some ways this is a more honest reflection of what's actually happening in the steel frame system. Because the columns and the beams are all in the same plane in the structure itself, and this seems to reflect that simply by the wall treating everything the same. It's all out on one plane rather than having bay windows or other things that stick out from it. So it's a very straightforward expression of what's happening underneath in the structure underneath. And also, the Marquette building expresses very clearly the proportions of the bays of the steel frame system. This wide bay, because the steel beams can be far apart. And if we look at one of the windows here, again, there's some wall, some cladding here, but the windows are very wide. Rather than having those traditional vertical windows that, say, Jenny had in his buildings, now the window itself is designed to show clearly that wide bay, the proportions of the steel frame system, and it established a pattern which came to be called the Chicago window. This wide window that often was broken into three parts, which in this case, and this became the standard pattern, to have a fixed window in the center, and then windows on the side that could actually be open, because this is still before the days of air conditioning. So the windows had to be operable, had to be able to open the windows, and but on the side, those were the parts on the side, and in the center you could have these big sheets of plate glass that would be fixed, and this became a standard pattern for these skyscraper windows, the Chicago window. And so the Marquette building was a very rational response to the problem of creating a new aesthetic for the skyscraper. Maybe even a little too rational, we might say. It's perhaps a little boring, maybe. But still, it's a very important and beautiful building in its own way. But at the same time that this was happening, another architect in Chicago was designing skyscrapers and other buildings that were less rational in some ways, we might say, but ultimately more interesting. And this is the person I'd like to look at now for the rest of the time today, who is Louis Sullivan, who of all the architects working in Chicago at this time was the most individualistic, certainly, and also the most complex, sometimes even difficult to understand. Certainly one of the most fascinating figures in American architecture. Just a little background. Sullivan was born in 1856 in Boston. His father was Irish. His mother was French. He was not part of the New England establishment. He was from a poor family. At age 16, he enrolled in courses on architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which had just recently started an architecture program. It was the first architecture school in America, founded in 1865, I believe. Then he left MIT after a year or so, went to Philadelphia, and managed to get a job in the office of an architect I was going to include a couple of lectures ago, but didn't get around to. I think I mentioned that Frank Furness I was going to drop. And here we see one of Furness's buildings, the Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, that he was working on and was being built when Sullivan was working in Furness's office. And basically, Furness is an example of this individualistic and kind of eccentric and peculiar, highly individualistic architect of the late 19th century. And Sullivan probably picked up some of his eccentricity from Furness. Then, without going into details about or describing Furness's work, but you just can get an idea here probably. Then in 1873, a depression hit America, and Sullivan was laid off like other architects, but he went to Chicago then and got a job in Jenny's office. The economic situation was better in Chicago at this time. They were rebuilding after the Great Fire, Chicago Fire. But then in 1874, Sullivan went to Paris and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts for a while. He was obviously restless and trying to experience as many different kinds of architectural educations as possible. He spent about 2 years in Paris, then returned to Chicago and worked in various offices. And then in 1879, he was hired by an engineer named Donkemar Adler, who was one of the people developing these new structural principles for the skyscraper. And in the following year, Adler, who liked Sullivan a lot and saw a lot of promise in him, made Sullivan his partner to handle more of the architectural design part of it, and Adler would be the engineer. This kind of division of functions in an architect's office. But after doing all of this, Sullivan was still only 24 years old. It was a meteoric rise. He was suddenly now a partner in a major Chicago firm. So that's one of the interesting things about his career. He also had kind of a meteoric fall, we might say, at the end of his career. He's a sort of tragic and interesting life story as well. He's a fascinating figure. When his first years with Adler, he designed a number of small buildings, but then in 1886, they got a major commission, probably the most important commission in Chicago at this time, even though strictly speaking it was not a skyscraper, or didn't use skyscraper construction. This is called the Auditorium Building. It still exists, of course, in Chicago. I'm showing an old photograph and color, an old black and white photo and a color photo. It's interesting. Sometimes black and white photographs are actually better to look at. Sometimes you can see the details in them more clearly. It's a gigantic structure which combined many different functions. Architects today would probably call it a multi-use building. It included the following. First of all, the auditorium itself that the building was named for, which was an opera house and still is, seating over 4,000 people. It was the largest auditorium, I think, in America at that time. Then there was also a hotel in the building with, of course, all of the functions that are needed for hotel ballrooms, dining rooms, and so forth. And the hotel has now been turned into a university, a whole university, Roosevelt University, that inhabits the building. But the Opera House still also is functioning. And then there was also an office building in it that went up into the tower that's down at that end. So it's an immense building. It probably was the largest and most complex building of this commercial building of this sort in America at the time. And if we look at a section drawing through the building, we can get a sense of its the scale and also the complexity. Here, of course, is the Opera House that's buried inside this building that extends the hotel and the other parts which wrap around it. So it represents kind of a new aspect of urban of design in cities, these huge buildings that today would probably be called multi-use buildings. Well, now, structurally, the building was very complex as well, although most of it was traditional masonry construction, not the steel frame. Adler handled the structural parts of it, and it was complicated to do for various reasons. But stylistically, just looking at what the building looks like on the outside, can you recognize the source? What do you think they were looking at? Yeah, I think it clearly is based on Richardson's Marshall Field warehouse. Not copied, of course, but this idea of these windows that divide up here and then they become half as wide, and as you can see, the proportions look inspired by the Marshall Field warehouse. Shows the appeal of Richardson to young architects of the period. Well, Sullivan devoted a great deal of attention to the design of the interiors of the building, and especially to ornament. Some of it rather traditional ornament, but some quite innovative. And here, just to look at a couple of views. That's a view of the Opera House interior over on the left, and it may be a little hard to see, but there's very elaborate ornament all over it, all of which was designed by Sullivan himself. Each part is different. Here's the main dining room in the hotel. You can see the patterns of ornament here and on the ceiling. Other ornament which is painted or stenciled on, but some of this is cast or carved ornament. The columns here with unusual innovative decoration on the capitals. Well, there's something I think a bit unexpected about this interest in ornament and decoration in a young architect in the progressive atmosphere of Chicago at this time. And you might think that, well, this would be something that, that he would soon drop as he became more progressive and would abandon this interest in decoration. But the interesting thing about Sullivan, one of the interesting things, is that he continued to be fascinated with ornament throughout his career, and it became even more of intense, this interest, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But first, let's see how Adler and Sullivan handled a real steel frame skyscraper. Here, their first true steel frame office building, which is another one of these milestones in American skyscraper history. This is called the Wainwright Building, and it's actually not in Chicago. It's in St. Louis. They started getting commissions for buildings in other cities, and still exists, and was begun in 1890, just about the same time as the Reliance Building. It certainly ranks with it as significant, similar importance. Well, the structure of the building is Jenny's steel frame system, just like what we saw before. The cladding is brick, and also there's some terracotta panels in between the piers. Here, this is terracotta, but most of it is brick cladding. And several years later, after building it, Sullivan described in an article that's also in the Reader, I believe, his philosophy of skyscraper construction. Sullivan, unlike a lot of the other architects and engineers, liked writing, and he published a good deal, and it's interesting to read his writings. Let me quote from this article of his. He expressed very well some of the attitudes of the Chicago school in general, as well as some of his more personal ideas that we'll get to. First of all, Sullivan describes the functions needed in a skyscraper. He says, first of all, you need a ground floor that's devoted mainly to an entrance and to circulation, and maybe shops on the ground floor, but you have to go through the ground floor to get up into the building, so a lot of that has to be circulation. And then there's the second floor, which may have meeting rooms and other kinds of special rooms. But then, he says, quote, above this, an indefinite number of stories of offices piled tier upon tier, one tier just like any other, one office just like all the other offices, an office being similar to a cell in a honeycomb. And then finally, on top, he points out, says that there has to be spaces for mechanical equipment, vents and water tanks and so forth. And so that divides up the building from a functional point of view into these separate parts. Then he goes on to describe how the design of a skyscraper should grow out of an acceptance of these conditions rather than trying to disguise them. He says the first two floors should have their own architectural character related to their functions. And then he says, quote, above this, throughout the indefinite number of typical office tiers, we take our cue from the individual cell, which requires a window with its separating pier, its sill and lintel, and we make them all look alike because they all are alike. And then he says when we get to the top floor or the attic, he says this gives us the power to show by means of its broad expansive wall and its dominating weight and character that the series of office tiers has come to an end. Well, this sounds very rational and functionalist, especially since Sullivan is famous for having said form follows function. He, as far as we know, he's the first person who really said that exactly like that, or wrote it so that it's documented. You remember that Horatio Greenough talked about function and form, and it certainly came close to that. That's basically what Greenough seems to have had in mind. But Sullivan seems to have been the person who really actually said form follows function. And but the interesting part of the story here is that this is really only half of the picture with Sullivan, this functionalist aspect. And he goes on and starts talking in a somewhat different vein. He writes the following then. He says, thus far, the results are only partial. We must now heed the imperative voice of emotion. It demands of us, what is the chief character of the tall office building? And at once we answer, it is lofty. This loftiness is to the artist its thrilling aspect. It must be in turn the dominant chord in his expression of it. It must be tall. And in the Wainwright Building here, let's try to analyze how Sullivan does this. And so let's look at the Wainwright Building. And it may be helpful to recall that steel frame system that's underneath the facade that we've seen before. So let me call back up again this engraving of the Fair Building under construction. Now let me throw out the question. Do you see anything interesting about the relationship between the structural system, because underneath the Wainwright Building, it's basically the structure that we see over on the left there, and the external design of the Wainwright Building? Are there any puzzling aspects or anything that you just noticed that's unusual? Yes?
The windows are recessed.
Okay, that's right. The windows are recessed, so they're not all out at the same plane, even though here everything, the columns and beams are all out on the same plane, right? So he's chosen to recess the windows, and why do you think he did that?
To promote the more vertical view.
Yeah, it definitely makes it more vertical, and he talks about how he wants that's the thrilling part of these buildings is that they're tall, and he wants to make them seem taller. And in fact, he does. The Wainwright Building is actually not that tall a building as these skyscrapers went, but it looks taller than it really is because of that. Anything else besides the recessing of the windows? Yes?
Those columns or pilasters.
Piers, one might call them.
But they're obviously not load-bearing, and they are much closer than the actual structure inside. And again, that's probably emphasizes, that makes it look taller than it actually is.
That's right. Why do you're definitely right. These are certainly closer than they are over here. And how do you think? What do you think's going on? I told you before that this is the structural system that's used here. So what do you think he's doing?
It's just aesthetic. It's just part of the
Yeah.
will make it look taller.
He's adding extra piers. Yeah. These are not structural. These are, you might say, they're unnecessary in a sense.
The ground floor is the reflection.
That's right, exactly. Here you see the actual steel frame structure is seen down here. That's good, a good observation. And so up here, he's just adding these. They're unnecessary. And is there anything else you notice? Yes?
Piers are also unbroken as they rise.
That's right. That's right. They all go all the way up. Though it's interesting, he still treats them as pilasters and has a kind of a column up at the top. It's just that the proportions become completely untraditional. What about the corner? What's going on at the corner? Why is that thicker at the corner? I mean, or is that necessary? No, because if you look at the steel frame system, the column on the corner is exactly the same as the column here. And in fact, from a structural point of view, this could even be thinner at the corner because it doesn't support as much weight. Technically, usually you make it all the same to make it more practical. So you certainly don't need a thicker column at the corner, and so that's unnecessary as well. And that's a little less clear why he does that. The other things that you pointed out, he clearly wants to make it look more vertical. Here, I don't know, he just maybe liked the looks of it, or he maybe thought that would also help it make it look more vertical if there are these very prominent piers at the corner. So
Is this a temple? And what's the top? The temple structure is where
yeah, maybe that's right. It may be that he's calling up an image of a temple to commerce, but
it seems kind of ridiculous. Talking the same like Horatio Greeley thing.
that's right.
Function.
Well, yes, it is from a completely rational point of view. And in fact, he clearly was willing to falsify the structural expression a bit in order to achieve the effect he wanted, to express this tall moving part of the building. So, but what I think it points out is that when Sullivan was talking about form follows function, he did not mean function in a completely mechanistic or just purely rational point of view, but in a more expressive or artistic or even a poetic kind of sense.
That is kind of mechanical.
Oh, as for the top, yes. Yeah, the top is treated differently because it's got mechanical equipment up there. Yeah, right. And I think all of this, which is getting now into sort of contradictory territory, this is one of the things that's interesting about Sullivan, that he seems in some ways to be contradicting himself. But he would have said that this all had to do with the way he interpreted function and form, that this made sense. Also, I think this helps us understand his interest in ornament, which on the surface at least would seem to be the opposite of functionalism. And this building, like most of his buildings, is covered with, or not completely covered, but has a lot of quite unconventional ornament. Oh, here, this is I forgot I had the slide in here that actually shows the Wainwright Building in construction. And you can see that, in fact, the steel frame is quite, is the traditional steel frame system. Here's a detail of this upper floor of the Wainwright Building with this very exuberant ornament. And his writings, where he talks about all this, reveal that he considered ornament to be, among other things, a kind of a symbolic expression of the forces within a building, either structural forces or maybe more abstract forces of vitality or power and things like that. Often when he writes about this, his tone is very poetic, sometimes even almost kind of mystical. So the precise meaning of all of this is a little hard to pin down. But it's clear that for Sullivan, ornament was an essential part of his buildings. So let's just look at some examples of this ornament, which is often amazing in its inventiveness and vitality, and it's often also just interesting to look at. And the ornament is often, though not always, concentrated at the top of a building as a kind of, and it seems for Sullivan to have been a kind of expression of the upward moving kind of vertical forces that almost can be released in a symbolic way at the top of the building. And I wish I had a better picture of this building. This is the Gage Building in Chicago, one of his smaller skyscraper buildings. And here, it's a good example. This is wonderful ornament up here. Again, if I had a good photograph, you'd see it's a very exuberant kind of ornament that looks like floral patterns or other things that are hard to, it has this almost like kind of an explosion, or a guy is, and it gives the impression, I've always had the kind of impression that it symbolizes or expresses a release of forces as in a geyser, as if it's shooting off at the top here, releasing the forces that are in the structure and the dynamism of the building, and it gets released up at the top. And to look now at his other major skyscraper besides the Wainwright Building, that's similar in shape and overall form, but the details, he treats the details differently. Each one of these he spent a lot of time designing all of the details. So this is not mass-produced. You'd kind of, which again is a kind of contradiction. You'd think that once the basic system for a skyscraper was worked out by these people, that they would be able to just repeat it. That it would be from a cost-effective point of view or a mass production point of view, it would be most effective just to use the same system. And it would, of course, it would be more efficient. But this was this other side of Sullivan, that he wanted to treat each building differently. So again, there's a kind of contradiction there. This is called the Guarantee Building, and it's in Buffalo, New York. On the top of the building, if you think of the Wainwright Building in your mind, where there was that solid band that went across, this is very different. It has these round windows up here, and the whole thing now is covered with ornaments, rather than just having it concentrated mainly at the top. So each one of these buildings is a little different. The details of the Guarantee Building are amazing to look at, because they're all different types of ornament. Some of Sullivan's ornament was more or less traditional. You have a sense here that this is made like a column with a capital, almost maybe a kind of variation of a Corinthian capital, perhaps. But most of his ornament is totally innovative and of various sorts. Some of it geometric. Here you see geometric patterns that are cast into this. I think this is all terracotta panels. Some of it is vaguely plant-like. The capital, and then over here in the left, it looks like these are maybe suggestions of plants, but not in a literal kind of way. Or strange membrane-like forms that are typical of his, all very innovative. He really created this, and he spent a lot of time drawing this and coming up with these unusual types of decoration that were really unprecedented. Now, it is true that some of his decoration, especially something like this with these curving lines and a kind of whiplash form here, are similar to decorative forms that were being used especially in Europe at this time, as part of what came to be known as the Art Nouveau style. And you could sort of see Sullivan as kind of an American equivalent of the Art Nouveau. But still, it's not exactly the same. And so it's basically just, it's an innovation of his. I think Sullivan's most amazing and elaborate ornament is found in a building in Chicago that's was built as the Schlesinger-Meyer store, is now Carson Perry Scott, a department store, begun in 1899, where for the two ground floors are, or the two lower floors are covered in this amazing ornament, all cast in iron in this case, but every detail designed by Sullivan himself. Ornament that's so intricate and intertwined that the forms almost seem to change or grow in front of our eyes. And Sullivan was fascinated, I think, with the idea of forms that somehow suggest movement or growing or organic kind of processes. So it's part of this poetic side to his character. But these are just amazing to look at. You can see again some of it's rather geometric, but then it gets invaded by these plant-like forms. They're not actually portraying in a literal sense real plants, but it just gives the sense of it. Or maybe again some membrane type forms. You don't quite know exactly what it is. It's just amazing stuff, and certainly unprecedented in any previous American architecture. But just as striking or interesting in this Schlesinger-Meyer store is the contrast between this ornament on the lower floors and the starkness of the rest of the building, which Sullivan clearly did on purpose for the power of its effect. Here's the whole building, what's now the Carson Perry Scott store in its original state, and you can see the strong contrast between the bottom floors with that amazing cast iron ornament and the upper floors that has none of it. And furthermore, because the building has a more horizontal than a vertical shape, I think that's probably the reason that Sullivan decided not to give it that doubled pier treatment that he used on the Wainwright and the Guarantee buildings. So here he has not added those extra superfluous piers, and as a result you have a very clear expression of the steel frame structure underneath, and he perhaps creates here the clearest expression anywhere, at least certainly at this time, of the character of the steel frame structure. Here's a close-up of these upper floors. It's almost impossible to believe that that's the same building that we're seeing two different slides of. But here in the upper floors, the columns and piers are given the same treatment, covered with glazed tiles, so that again there's no emphasis given to either horizontal or vertical. It shows clearly the plane of the steel frame structure. The Chicago window here with one great plate glass window in the center and the operable windows on the side. So a beautiful expression of this underlying system. So the building together, when we see the whole building, top and bottom, It expresses beautifully these two sides of Sullivan's architectural temperament: the technological, functional side, the rational side, we might say, and the expressive and individualistic and poetic side, which somehow cohabit in this strange kind of way in Sullivan's work. Let me just give a final note on Sullivan, what happened to him. After about 1900, his career went, even though he was still very young, his career went into a decline for various personal reasons, and also because his work was sort of going out of fashion. He did some small commissions, and I'll just show a couple of them very briefly, such as tombs in cemeteries. Here's the Wainwright tomb. The Wainwright family that had built his Wainwright Building in St. Louis had him design a tomb in the cemetery for them, and you can see he's experimenting again with his an inventive ornament, but now just constructed in stone. Kind of a letdown from the progressive, his skyscraper designs. Another one is a bank building he designed in Owatonna, Minnesota, that again is conventional construction. He wasn't getting any commissions for major buildings, skyscraper buildings anymore, but it has some of the most wonderful ornament, so picking up on that side of his work. But his work did go out of fashion, and he actually, his last years were very tragic. But his legacy continued in a sense in the work of one of his assistants who had worked in his office in the 1890s, or actually around 1890 when he was designing the auditorium building. And his assistant's name was Frank Lloyd Wright, and so we will be looking at Frank Lloyd Wright when we pick up next time. If any of you have any questions, I'll hang around for a few more minutes.